can go ahead and open up to Psalm chapter 2. Psalm 2. Before we get started, we will be passing around the trays. So if anyone wants a single serve packet, instead, if you would just raise your hand and we'll get it to you. Okay. In our men's study on Tuesday night, we looked at the first king of the Israelites, Saul. And one of the things that we talked about Saul was really how inadequate he was as a king. And ultimately, the only reason he had that office to begin with was because the Israelites had begged God for a king. Throughout the whole Bible, we have this thread that no matter who the king is, outside of God, they're ultimately going to be inadequate. Whenever the Israelites begged for this king, God says, "You have rejected me as king." Right? And every single king, even the good ones, David and the handful of other good kings, ultimately fall short of holding the office as king. Mistakes are made, sin persists in the life of the king, until God himself comes down as king, and we have Christ the king. Jesus often used Psalms to talk about himself. For instance, in John chapter 15, he quotes Psalm 69, and he makes the point that the psalm is about David, but ultimately it's about Jesus himself, our true king. A lot of times the messianic songs talk about David, but really they're pointing to the greater David, to Christ, our king. So this morning, as we get our minds ready for the Lord's Supper, we're going to read Psalms 2, which talks about Jesus, our king, and make some application points in his example of going to the cross for us. So let's go ahead and read this chapter, Psalm chapter 2. Why do the nations rage, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together, against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you.' Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." When we read this in Psalm 2, we see that no earthly king could possibly justify the glory of these promises. The language here, it spills out, and the things that are said of this king are far too great to be accomplished by any earthly king. In verse 2, the kings of the earth have taken their stand against them, against the anointed one, the Lord's Messiah. The middle section, verses 4 through 9, tell us that we have a true king, a king installed, set on the holy hill by God, a king above all kings. My king, he says. Verses 1 through 3 tell us that the earthly kings, or the earthly heart, really has rejected the king. So we have a true king, verses 4 through 9. The people rejected the king, verses 1 through 3. And then verses 10 through 12 are a summons to us that though we have a king, and though at some point we all rejected the king, we need the king. So we're going to break apart those three sections here the next few minutes. We're going to jump around and start with verses 4 through 9. We have a king. God says we have all of these kings around, but there's a king above all kings. My king that he has installed and set on his holy hill. The actual record of kings here on this earth is abysmal. It's full of tyranny and slavery. But we were built for a king. a great king, one who does rule with compassion and power and glory and wisdom and justice, so that his power and wisdom and glory are like the sun shining in its full strength. We know that we were built to give ourselves to and to love and to adore and to serve and to know that king and to submit to that king. That's what the Bible says. There is a king above all kings. And anything good that we've experienced here in this life is just a dim reflection of the true king, a true king who has gone before us to fight the battle against sin, that without him, we would have had no hope of winning. A true king who gave every aspect of his life on this earth for us, even to the point of dying on a cross for us, so that no matter what happens to us in this life, we're safe and secure in the end. A king that was willing to lay down his life every single day because of his love and his compassion that he has for us. In Hebrews 1, Psalms 2 is quoted, "To what earthly king or even angel could God truly say, 'You are my begotten son, and all the ends of the earth are your possession'?" God has literally said this to someone, and that's to Jesus, our true king. Verses 1 through 3 tell us that though we have this true king described in verses 4 through 9, that we have rejected the king. The kings of the earth seem to be upset here because they have an owner. And depending on your translation, it may say cords or fetters or chains. But there is someone who demands that they be fettered. That someone who has created them has power over them. This is the basic impulse of every human heart. What the world does and what the world wants us to do is to convince ourselves the greatest lie ever told, that I am my own. That's how sin began in the world, back in the garden with a serpent telling Eve that she could do whatever she wanted and be whoever she wanted to be and be full. It's the same lie that we've told ourselves every time that we've knowingly sinned. I am my own. I don't want these fetters or this yoke. The Bible says that the natural heart hates the idea of a king, someone who has rights over us, who says, "You belong to me. You are not your own." Those of us who are Christians and have gathered here today to remember the Lord's sacrifice recognize our need to be yoked by the king. We recognize that really, when we try to live with the mindset of I am my own, that we're really messing up ourselves both in this life a lot of times and certainly in the life to come. And even then, when you were living in sin and rebellion, our true king still loved us enough to sacrifice his life on the cross, lovingly and humbly hoping all things that one day we would recognize our need for the true king. All right, so 4 through 9, we have a king. Verses 1 through 3, at some point, we have all rejected the king. Verses 10 through 12, we need the king. Verses 10 through 12 say, you need to understand the need for the king. But there is no in-between. Either you serve the king and you love the king and you'll find a refuge in him and be blessed, or you won't serve, you won't rejoice, and you will perish. There's no refuge from the king. There's only refuge in the king. You need the king. The yoke or the fetters from verses 1 through 3 eventually become a refuge for us. The confinement becomes spaciousness. The service becomes freedom. If you pull the yoke off your back, you will perish. In fact, the yoke is the only way to get into freedom. Let's say you have a kid that wants to be really good at piano. Like, she really wants this to be realized. And so what do? The yoke. Every day she is yoked to the piano. Every day she practices. Some days she wants to, and some days she doesn't, but for hours, every single day, she is yoked to the piano. But as time goes on, her skills begin to blossom. As time goes on, she begins to express herself in a way that she never could without the yoke. The yoke becomes a refuge. The yoke becomes blessedness. You have the potential for growth here on this earth and to eventually put on an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. That will only come by willingly putting on the yoke. To believe and obey the King that we need. The King who willingly came here for us while we were rejecting him. Who came here to live the life that we should have lived and to die the death that we deserve to die. And offers us the opportunity to put on his yoke and an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison that none of us deserve. So as we go into the Lord's Supper observance, I want us to think about this true King that we have, that fully holds the office of King, who gave himself entirely for us, who came here to die for us even while we were rejecting him. The King that we as Christians now have, the King that we need. So I'm going to go ahead and give thanks for the bread, and Rob's going to help me pass around the bread. We'll move into our Lord's Supper observance.